Rick Warren has spent decades comforting millions with words of hope, purpose, and healing. But behind that calm voice and steady smile lies a wound that time has never been able to close, ever since the unimaginable tragedy that struck his family on April 5, 2013. The man who guided the world through its darkest moments has been quietly battling a darkness of his own. And now, new heartbreaking news suggests that the weight he's carried for more than a decade may be growing even heavier. This is the story of a father shattered, a family forever changed, and a legacy tested by pain so deep that even the strongest faith can tremble beneath it. Most people will never understand the truth about Rick Warren. Long before grief carved permanent scars into his life, the world had already watched him break in front of millions. His public collapse didn't begin in 2013, it began years earlier, when the rapid rise of Saddleback Church made him one of the most influential pastors in America and one of the most controversial. His purpose-driven model transformed struggling congregations into thriving communities, but it also tore others apart. Churches split down the middle, friendships shattered in parking lots, and pastors weaponized Rick's ideas in ways he never intended. Every time a sanctuary erupted into conflict because people were arguing over his strategies, Rick felt a punch of guilt he never admitted publicly. He begged leaders not to force change, not to treat people like casualties, not to turn growth into a war, but the damage outpaced his warnings. And just as the storm finally began to settle, an even bigger one swallowed him whole. In 2008, Barack Obama invited Rick to pray at the presidential inauguration. It should have been the highest honor of his career. Instead, it became a national firestorm. Activists unearthed a letter Rick had written to his own church expressing his belief that marriage, biblically, was between a man and a woman. Overnight, he went from America's pastor to America's villain. Protests erupted, headlines accused him of hate speech, and strangers who had never met him demanded he be removed from the inauguration. The irony was almost cruel. Rick had spent years hugging HIV patients, building friendships in the LGBTQ community, and pouring millions into AIDS relief worldwide. But none of that mattered. In a moment of cultural rage, the world didn't want nuance. It wanted a face to throw stones at. Obama defended him, reminding the nation that disagreement did not equal hatred. Yet the backlash scorched anyway. And while one side condemned him for being too conservative, the other side turned on him for being too compassionate. Evangelicals accused him of compromise simply for sitting down with Muslims, sharing meals with imams, and speaking about peace, poverty, and human dignity. Every bridge Rick tried to build was twisted into a betrayal. Every attempt at gentleness was spun as weakness. And yet, none of these battles, not the protests, not the headlines, not the betrayals, prepared him for the agony that would come next. When his son Matthew was only 7, doctors diagnosed him with clinical depression. Rick and Kay stared at the words, unable to fathom how a child so young could carry a darkness so heavy. But even as a toddler, Matthew sensed the pain others tried to hide. He was gentle, pure-hearted, and heartbreakingly perceptive, the kind of kid who walked into a room and instantly found the one person who was hurting. He could feel sadness the way other children felt temperature. Yet behind that sensitivity lived a storm no one could calm. And as he grew older, that storm only deepened. With every passing year, Rick felt more helpless, more terrified, more desperate to save the son he adored. And nothing, not fame, not influence, not decades of preaching hope could prepare him for the day that storm finally swallowed Matthew whole. Maybe it was because Matthew recognized the pain in others the same, the pain that lived inside him like a silent storm every single day. Friends used to say he could walk into a crowded room and instantly find the one person who was struggling. He was drawn to brokenness, almost like he could feel it vibrating in the air. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. The boy who comforted everyone else was drowning faster than anyone knew how to save him. Rick Warren would later describe his son as kind, gentle, compassionate, brilliant. But that was only the part of Matthew the world saw. Behind the public smile, behind the polite conversations at church and the warm hugs he gave without hesitation, the Warren family was fighting a private war. Endless doctor appointments, medications that numbed him or made him worse, therapists who tried their best but couldn't reach the darkness that curled itself around Matthew's mind like barbed wire. Rick and Kay tried everything, every specialist, every advanced treatment, every prayer whispered over their son's name by strangers across the world. But nothing worked, and Matthew knew it. At 17, during one of the darkest nights of his life, he sat across from his father and asked a question no parent should ever face. He told Rick that it was obvious, painfully, brutally obvious, that he would never get better. They had tried it all. So he looked his father in the eyes and asked, "Why can't I just die and go to heaven?" Rick begged him to keep fighting, to hold on longer, to believe there might be something ahead they hadn't tried yet. And Matthew did hold on, for 10 more years. 10 years of waking up trapped inside a mind that attacked him from the inside. 10 years of smiling with friends while a storm raged in silence. 10 years of exhaustion so deep that even breathing felt like work. And yet through it all, Rick carried a secret fear in his chest, a fear he couldn't voice. He knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that something terrible was coming. A father's intuition, a dread he woke up with every morning. a nightmare he prayed would never come true. On April 5, 2013, the Warren family had a beautiful night together. They laughed, they talked, they enjoyed each other. Everything seemed fine. Matthew seemed fine. But depression is a master of disguise. Sometime the next morning, alone in his apartment in Mission Viejo, Matthew reached the end of a pain he could no longer outrun, and in what Rick later called a momentary wave of despair, he took his own life. A self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun unregistered, its serial number scratched off, illegally purchased online by a young man desperate for a way out. California's strict gun laws couldn't stop him. Nothing could. Hours later, Rick and Kay Warren received the call that split their world in two. Their brilliant, tender-hearted son was gone. Rick had to identify his child's body. No sermon could prepare him. No theology could soften it. No faith could shield him from the sound his wife made when she heard the news. Within half an hour, their small group friends who had walked with them through decades of ministry showed up at their door. But nothing, not even the love in that room, could stop the brutal truth from settling. Their son was gone, and life would never be the same again. They didn't call, they didn't text, and they didn't wait for permission. They simply appeared on that sidewalk, standing shoulder to shoulder, wrapping their arms around Rick and Kay Warren as if their presence alone could hold the broken pieces together. Later, Rick would say something that echoed across churches worldwide: the deeper the pain, the fewer words you need. That night, their small group, the same people who had prayed with them, laughed with them, lived life with them for decades, spread themselves across every inch of the Warren home. Some slept on couches, others on floors, others in chairs. They refused to leave. "We're not letting you walk through this night alone," they said. And they didn't. The next morning, Rick wrote to his congregation at Saddleback, a church he had pastored for 33 years, a church where he had comforted thousands through grief and loss. This time he wasn't the shepherd leading the hurting. He was the father whose world had collapsed. "No words can express the anguished grief we feel right now," he wrote. "Our youngest son, Matthew, aged 27, and a lifelong member of Saddleback, died today." He spoke of Matthew's kindness, his intelligence, his compassion, but he also told the truth that most pastors hide. He said they had tried everything America had to offer: the best doctors, the best therapists, the best medications, the best prayers. Yet the torture of mental illness never loosened its grip on him. The news went global within hours. Rick Warren, the pastor whose book shaped millions, the man whose purpose-driven message rebuilt broken lives, had lost his son to suicide. And the response was swift, relentless. Some asked how a man who helped so many find hope couldn't save his own child. Others, with disturbing cruelty, suggested God was judging him. Rick ignored most of the noise, but public grief is a strange kind of suffering. Everyone wants something from you: a quote, a reaction, a lesson, a justification. But Rick had more immediate responsibilities. He had to plan a funeral that the world wanted to attend. But the Warren family knew the truth: there was no building in Orange County big enough to hold the crowds. So they chose a private ceremony, just family, with just loved ones. And instead of flowers or cards, they asked people to give to the Matthew Warren Fund for Mental Health. The donations poured in by the thousands. Then Rick disappeared. He stepped away from preaching for 4 months. 16 weeks of silence. 16 weeks of wrestling with God, with anger, with heartbreak, with the kind of questions pastors aren't supposed to ask. When you spend that much time in serious conversation with the Almighty, he later said, it changes you. And when he finally returned to the Saddleback stage in late July, everyone could see the change. Rick's voice cracked more easily. He didn't just understand suffering, he embodied it. He knew what it felt like to bury your child, and that kind of grief rewires a soul. The sermon that day was titled, Getting Through What You're Going Through, chosen weeks before Matthew's death, almost as if the universe had been preparing him for a moment he never wanted to face. He broke down more than once. Kay stood beside him, wiping tears off his face in front of thousands. She spoke with the quiet courage of a mother whose heart had been shattered. She told the congregation that Matthew's body had been broken by the gun, that it had failed him, but now he would be raised in glory. She spoke of the ache she would carry until the day she saw her son again. And then she said a line people still quote today: "It's okay to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time." That moment didn't just move Saddleback Church, it sparked a movement. Rick and Kay turned their unbearable grief into a mission. They launched one of the largest church-led mental health initiatives in the nation: workshops, conferences, suicide prevention programs, partnerships with the Catholic Diocese of Orange, with NAMI, with psychiatrists, therapists, researchers, and anyone willing to help. They built a bridge between faith and mental health to worlds that had been separated for far too long. And all of it, every ounce of it, was because of Matthew. He began asking the question no one in the church had the courage to voice out loud. Why is there shame when the brain breaks, but not when the heart fails or the kidneys shut down? Rick Warren tore apart the old stigma brick by brick, not with anger, but with grief sharpened into truth. He spoke about Matthew openly now, calling him brave, braver than most people will ever understand, because Matthew fought for 10 more years after asking his father why he couldn't just die. Rick read thousands of letters from people Matthew had led to Christ, people his son comforted, encouraged, or helped through their own darkness. And in his journal, Rick wrote words that became a philosophy of survival in God's garden of grace. Even broken trees bear fruit. He clung to that line like a lifeline, a way to wrestle meaning out of the senseless. He forgave the man who sold Matthew the gun. He forgave the system. He even forgave the randomness of life itself. Rick never doubted God's goodness, he doubted God's plan. And he said that difference mattered. He believed that, in a world with free will, Matthew's choice belonged to Matthew, not to God, not to fate, not to destiny. That belief was the only way he could keep breathing when everything inside him wanted to collapse. Rick kept calling his son brave because Matthew survived. 27 years of torment that would have broken most people in a fraction of that time. Brave for trying every therapy. Brave for waking up every day with pain wrapped around his mind like chains. Brave for fighting a battle no one could see. But while Rick honored Matthew's bravery, he also carried the unspoken truth he never healed. He didn't move on or get closure. He learned to walk with grief as a companion, like a second heart beating inside his chest. Rick admitted he cried every single day after Matthew died, and he didn't apologize for it. Grief wasn't weakness, it was love refusing to disappear. Mental health became his calling. His sermons shifted. His leadership shifted. His view of ministry shifted. In 2024, he was still pushing the church to confront mental illness. Working with California Catholic bishops to write hope and healing. A pastoral letter that became a blueprint for mental health ministries worldwide. He preached, "Your chemistry is not your character. Your illness is not your identity." Repeating the words like he could stop someone else's child from becoming another Matthew. By 2025, he was still traveling, speaking globally, pouring himself into purpose-driven work, recording devotionals, launching mental health initiatives, and giving away 91% of his income. But in the quiet moments, between sermons in airports and conferences, Rick Warren was still that father kneeling on a sidewalk in Mission Viejo, still the man who couldn't save his son, still haunted by the memory of Matthew at 17 asking why he couldn't just die. And here is the heartbreaking part most people never hear. More than a decade later, Rick Warren is still grieving. The pain never faded. It simply became the invisible weight he now carries through every sermon, every smile, every breath. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some wounds don't find out, some wounds don't fade. They simply become scars you learn to breathe around. Rick Warren learned to function with a shattered heart, to stand at gravesides and tell people that God's garden of grace allows even broken trees to bear fruit. But his tree, it's still broken. It always will be. He preaches hope while carrying despair, talks about God's goodness while quietly wrestling with God's plan. He helps millions find their purpose while asking himself, in the deepest corners of his soul, whether he could have done more for Matthew. That's the cruel paradox of ministry: pouring out strength you don't have, offering comfort you desperately need, serving a world that demands answers you don't possess. Rick says his faith didn't break, and maybe that's true. He never doubted God's existence, never doubted heaven, never doubted that Matthew's broken body is now whole and free. That belief is the thin thread holding his world together, because without it, his son's death becomes nothing but random, merciless tragedy. But is Rick Warren fine? He admits he's different, more tender, more emotional, more attuned to the suffering vibrating inside other people. The polished pastor who built a global movement is gone. What remains is someone raw, scarred, deeply human, someone who wakes up every Monday with crushing self-doubt, wondering if he's enough for the church he leads. Someone who carries everyone else's burdens while quietly drowning under his own. He tells people God won't give you more than he equips you to bear, but what happens when the load is too heavy, when faith and therapy and prayer still don't fix the brokenness? Rick doesn't have that answer. No one does. So he simply keeps going, pausing in sermons when emotion overtakes him, choking up in interviews, posting late-night reflections that reveal more pain than peace. Kay stands next to him, drying his tears with hands that shake from her own grief. They are not who they once were. They can't be. There is no neat ending here. No miraculous healing. No perfectly resolved testimony, just a father carrying the unending weight of losing his child, forgiving the man who sold Matthew the gun because grace demands the impossible, and waking up every day choosing hope even when heartbreak shadows every step. So, is Rick Warren fine? Maybe the real answer is this: he's surviving. And sometimes, for a grieving parent, surviving is the bravest thing in the world.